His name was Darian Cole, and the day he walked back into the city that had once belonged to him, the sky was gray, the streets were quiet, and not a single person who saw him recognized who he was. That was exactly how he wanted it. 7 years had passed. 7 years of silence, of distance, of building himself back up from nothing. 7 years since the people he trusted most had gathered behind closed doors and decided, without his knowledge, to remove him from everything he had created. The company, the partnerships, the name he had spent a decade turning into something that mattered. But Darian was back now, and he had not come back to ask for anything. He had come back because it was time. 20 years before that gray morning, Darian Cole had been a young man with very little money and a very large dream. He grew up in the eastern part of the city, in a neighborhood where people worked hard but rarely got far. His father worked at a factory. His mother cleaned offices at night. They were not poor in the way that breaks people, but they were always careful, always calculating, always aware that there was no safety net waiting beneath them. Darian watched both of his parents and learned one thing above all else. Working hard for someone else would never give you real freedom. You had to build something of your own, something no one could take from you. He started small, a logistics company, just 3 vans and a rented storage room. He handled deliveries for local businesses, showed up on time every single day, and treated every client like they were the most important person in the world. Within 2 years, he had 20 vans. Within 5, he had a full operations center and contracts with some of the largest suppliers in the region. People began to notice him. Investors came. Partners came. The business grew into something much bigger than 3 vans. At his highest point, Darian ran an organization of nearly 400 people. He knew many of them by name. He attended their family events, helped when someone fell sick, and made sure that no one who worked hard for him ever felt invisible. That was the kind of leader he was. Not perfect, but present. Not above everyone, but always there. The 4 people who would later betray him were, at one point, the people he loved most. Marcus was his oldest friend. They had grown up on the same street. Marcus had joined the company in its 2nd year and risen to become the head of operations. Darian had promoted him, defended him, and trusted him completely. Elena was the company's financial director. She was intelligent, focused, and deeply ambitious. Darian had hired her away from a large firm and given her more responsibility than she had ever been offered anywhere else. She was grateful for years. And then, slowly, she stopped being grateful and started being calculating. There was also Raymond, the legal counsel, who had helped build the company's contracts and partnerships from the beginning, and Priya, the head of client relations, who had a gift for making everyone feel comfortable and, as Darian would later understand, an equal gift for using that comfort to gather information. These 4 people sat at the inner circle of everything Darian had built. He had no reason to doubt them. That was the part he would think about for years afterward. Not the betrayal itself, but how completely he had failed to see it coming. The plan they carried out was not done in anger. That was what made it so cold. It was done carefully, over many months, in small steps that each seemed unimportant on their own. Elena began moving money into accounts that were technically connected to the company, but practically under her control. She did it slowly enough that the changes were easy to miss in routine reviews. Raymond quietly adjusted certain contracts so that, in the event of a leadership dispute, the board would have grounds to override the founder. Marcus met regularly with a competing investor group, sharing information about the company's operations. Not enough to be obviously wrong, but enough to shift the balance of interest away from Darian. And Priya, warm and charming as ever, began planting doubts among key clients. Nothing direct, just small questions, just tiny seeds of uncertainty about whether the company's direction was sound under its current leadership. By the time Darian noticed that something felt wrong, the ground had already shifted beneath him. He could feel it, the slight change in how people spoke to him in meetings, the way certain conversations would stop when he entered a room. But he could not yet see clearly what was happening. Then came the board meeting that changed everything. He arrived expecting a routine quarterly review. What he found was a prepared case against him. Financial irregularities, they said, pointing to the very accounts Elena had manipulated. Leadership concerns, they said, repeating the exact doubts Priya had placed in the minds of clients. A conflict of interest, they said, citing a contract clause Raymond had quietly inserted months earlier. Darian sat very still through all of it. He did not raise his voice. He did not beg. He looked at each of the four faces he knew better than almost anyone else in his life, and he understood, in that moment, that they had built this case together. Every word of it was prepared. Every document was ready. Every board member had been spoken to in advance. By the end of the day, he was removed from his own company. The organization he had built from 3 vans and a rented room no longer had his name on the door. He drove out of the city that evening and did not look back. The weeks that followed were the hardest of his life, not because of the financial loss, though that was significant, and not because of the public embarrassment, though that was real too. The hardest part was the silence. The people who had called him regularly stopped calling. The invitations stopped. The warmth disappeared like water from a dry cloth, so quickly that it was almost impossible to believe it had ever been there. He moved to a small town 3 hours from the city. He rented a modest house and spent the first 2 months doing almost nothing. He walked, he read, he sat in the evenings and stared at nothing. He needed that time. He was not ready to rebuild. He was still processing the weight of what had happened, not just what was done to him, but who had done it. Grief does not always come from loss of life. Sometimes, it comes from the loss of belief in the people you loved. That kind of grief is quieter, but it goes very deep. But Darian was not the kind of man who stayed down forever. He never had been. After those 2 months, something in him shifted. He stopped looking backward and started looking forward. Not with anger. Anger was too heavy to carry over a long distance. He began working again, quietly, under a different name at first, consulting for small businesses that needed help with logistics and operations. He lived simply. He saved carefully. He studied everything that had gone wrong in his own company from the outside, the decisions that had been made without him, the clients who had left, the partnerships that had collapsed. He watched the organization he had built slowly begin to struggle under its new leadership. Not because he wished harm on anyone, but because he was taking notes. Over the next 5 years, Darian built a second company. It was different from the first in important ways. He was more careful about who he trusted. He moved more slowly with his inner circle, watching people for a long time before giving them real access. He kept certain things close to himself that he might once have shared openly. The experience of betrayal had not made him cold, but it had made him wise. The second company grew steadily. By the end of the 5th year, it was operating in 4 cities and had become a serious competitor in the same industry where Darian had first made his name. People in the business world began to talk about this new organization, this quiet but consistently growing company. Very few of them connected it to Darian Cole. That was deliberate. He was not ready to be seen yet. He was still building. In the 6th year, he got a phone call from someone he had not expected to hear from. It was Thomas Adekunle, one of the original board members from his first company, one of the few who had genuinely seemed uncomfortable during that final meeting. Thomas said he had been watching. He said the company was in serious trouble. He said there were things Darian needed to know. They met for coffee in a neutral city. Thomas explained that the 4 who had removed Darian had since turned on each other. Elena had been quietly removed after an internal audit revealed the very financial issues she had used to frame Darian. This time, without anyone to blame them on. Raymond had resigned under pressure following a legal dispute that had cost the company an important contract. Marcus had been pushed out by a new investor group that had bought a controlling stake. Priya was still there, but her influence had shrunk to almost nothing. The company that had once been Darian's was now hollowed out. Revenue had dropped by nearly 60%. Key clients had left. The staff had shrunk from 400 to just over 90 people. The name still existed. The building still stood. But the life had gone out of it. Darian listened to all of this without satisfaction and without bitterness. He simply nodded. He thanked Thomas. And on the drive home, he made the decision that had been forming slowly for years. It was time to go back. He did not return dramatically. He did not announce himself. He simply began making calls to old clients, people who had worked with him years ago and remembered what that experience had been like. Several of them responded immediately. A few of them had been waiting for exactly this kind of call without knowing it. He also contacted several key staff members who had left the original company after his removal. People who had been loyal to him but had no choice once he was gone. They came. One by one, they came back. Not because Darian asked them to perform loyalty, but because they remembered what it felt like to work for someone who actually cared whether they went home feeling respected. Within 3 months of his return to the city, Darian's second company had signed contracts with 6 of the original company's largest former clients. The word spread quickly in the industry. People began to understand what was happening, and the board of his old company finally understood it too, far too late. They approached him, formally, through Thomas, who had remained in contact. They asked whether Darian would consider some kind of partnership, or perhaps a merger. Whether there was a path forward. Darian met with them once. He sat across the table from faces he no longer recognized in the way he once had. Not because they had changed, but because he had. He looked at them without hostility and without warmth. He was simply clear. He said he had no interest in recovering what had been taken from him. He had already built something better. He said he bore no personal wish for anyone in that room to suffer further. What had happened between them was now simply history, but he would not be entering into any agreement with the organization, and he would not be stepping back from the clients and partnerships his company had built. He thanked them for their time and left. Within 2 years of his return, Darian's second company had become the dominant force in the industry. The original company was eventually sold to a larger group for a fraction of what it had once been worth. Marcus had moved away. Elena was working in a different field entirely. Raymond had retired quietly. Priya had started over in a different city. People in the business world told the story of Darian Cole in different ways, depending on what they wanted to take from it. Some told it as a warning about trust, about how even the people closest to you can turn if the conditions are right. Some told it as a lesson in patience, about waiting for the right moment rather than reacting in the moment of pain. Some told it as a story about what real power actually looks like, and how it cannot be taken from a person by removing them from a room, because it was never in the room to begin with. It was always inside them. Darian himself rarely spoke about it. When he was asked in interviews what had driven him during his years away from the industry, he would pause, and then he would say something simple. He would say that the time away had been the most valuable period of his life. Not the most comfortable, not the most happy, but the most valuable. Because it had stripped away everything that was not essential, and forced him to understand what he was actually made of. He would say that being removed had felt, for a long time, like the worst thing that could happen to a person. But looking back, he understood that it was the thing that had made him who he was. He would not have chosen it, but he would not have traded it either. On the morning of the day he signed the contract that made his second company the largest in its field, Darian Cole stood at the window of his new office, a different building, a different floor, a different view, and looked out at the city that had once pushed him out, and then quietly watched him come back. He did not feel proud in the way people might expect. He felt something quieter than that. He felt settled, like a man who had finally arrived somewhere he had been walking toward for a long time, through weather that had not always been kind. He thought, briefly, about his parents, about his father at the factory, and his mother cleaning offices in the dark, calculating, careful, never with a safety net. He thought about the boy who had watched them, and decided he would build something no one could take from him. And then he thought about the lesson that boy had not yet understood, but the man at the window now knew with complete certainty. They can take the company, they can take the contracts, the name on the door, the office, the chair. They can take every visible thing, but they cannot take what you know how to do. They cannot take who you are. They cannot take the years you spent learning, building, and caring about people who depended on you. Those things go with you when you leave. They wait with you during the silence, and they walk back through the door with you when you return. Darian picked up his coffee, turned away from the window, and sat down at his desk. There was work to do.